It all started on what looked like a completely ordinary morning, the kind where nothing feels out of place and no one expects drama to unfold, yet beneath that calm surface, a quiet tension had been building for weeks without most people realizing it. The neighborhood had always followed a predictable rhythm, neighbors minding their own business, rules being accepted without much discussion, and HOA authority operating in the background like an unquestioned fact of life. For a long time, no one really challenged it, not because everyone agreed with every rule, but because confrontation felt exhausting and unnecessary. And at the center of that system stood the HOA Karen, a woman who had grown comfortable in her role, so comfortable that she began mistaking silence for agreement and compliance for respect. She believed that as long as she spoke with certainty and carried her clipboard like a badge, people would fall in line automatically, just as they always had. That morning, however, something subtle was different. The confidence she carried felt heavier, almost forced, as if she sensed resistance even before it appeared. She began her routine inspections, knocking on doors, reminding residents of regulations, and issuing warnings in the same practiced tone she had used countless times before. But what she didn't realize was that behind closed doors and quiet smiles, people had started comparing notes. They had begun noticing patterns in how rules were enforced, how certain residents were targeted while others were ignored, and how questions were often met with intimidation rather than answers. That awareness hadn't erupted into open conflict yet, but it was there, quietly reshaping how people viewed her authority. When she finally approached the house that would change everything, she expected another quick interaction, another resident who would nod, apologize, and comply. Instead, she was met with calm. Not defiance, not anger, just calm. The homeowner listened, didn't interrupt, didn't raise their voice, and that alone unsettled her. Calm responses remove the power from authority figures who rely on emotional pressure, and she felt it instantly. She repeated herself, emphasizing her position, expecting the usual reaction, but it never came. Instead, she was asked a simple question, one that required clarity, not dominance. And in that moment, the balance shifted. She tried to regain control by escalating her tone slightly, referencing rules and consequences, but the homeowner didn't push back aggressively. They simply asked for documentation, for explanation, for process. Each request was polite, reasonable, and impossible to dismiss without revealing how fragile her authority actually was. Neighbors began to notice the interaction, slowing their walks, pausing their routines, watching from a distance. What they saw wasn't a dramatic confrontation, but something far more unsettling for someone like her. A public moment where intimidation failed to work. As more eyes turned toward the exchange, she realized she was no longer speaking to one person, but to an audience. Her words became less precise, her posture stiffened, and the confidence she once relied on began to fracture under quiet scrutiny. She wasn't being attacked, she wasn't being shouted down, yet she was losing ground with every sentence. The power she had always assumed was permanent was now being tested, not through rebellion but through reason. And reason, unlike fear, doesn't bend easily. What made the situation truly uncomfortable for her wasn't open resistance, but the absence of it. She had prepared herself for arguments, raised voices, maybe even insults, because those were the moments where she felt most in control. Conflict gave her something to push against. But this was different. The homeowner's calm demeanor created a silence that exposed every weakness in her authority. Each time she spoke, she expected emotional reactions, yet all she received were measured responses and thoughtful pauses. That silence stretched longer than she anticipated, and with every passing second, it became harder for her to justify her position without sounding repetitive. She attempted to reframe the situation by leaning heavily on her title, reminding the homeowner that she represented the HOA and that her word carried weight. But the way she delivered it lacked the certainty it once had. The homeowner didn't challenge her role. Instead, they acknowledged it politely and asked how the rule applied in this specific case. It was a reasonable question, but one she wasn't prepared to answer clearly. Her authority had always relied on general statements and implied consequences, not detailed explanations. Being asked to clarify forced her into unfamiliar territory, where confidence alone wasn't enough. As neighbors continued to gather, the atmosphere shifted from private interaction to public moment. People weren't recording or interrupting, they were simply watching. That presence alone changed everything. The HOA Karen became increasingly aware that every word she spoke was now being heard by more than just one person. She slowed her speech, chose her words more carefully, and avoided making direct threats. For the first time, she seemed aware that intimidation would not only fail but could backfire. The crowd didn't need to say anything, their attention was enough. She tried pivoting, suggesting that the matter could be handled later, or reviewed internally, but even that attempt revealed something important. Authority that suggests delay when questioned often signals uncertainty. The homeowner agreed calmly, thanking her for stopping by and stating they would wait for proper documentation. There was no triumph in their tone, no sense of victory, just closure. And that lack of drama was exactly what made the moment powerful. She hadn't been defeated loudly, she had been exposed quietly. When she finally stepped back, clutching her clipboard tighter than before, there was no confrontation to replay in her mind, no argument to justify her actions. There was only the realization that her power had depended on people reacting emotionally, and without that reaction, it had nowhere to stand. The neighbors dispersed slowly, exchanging glances that carried a shared understanding. Something had changed and everyone felt it. The HOA Karen walked away, still holding her title, but now fully aware that titles alone don't command respect, behavior does. The real damage to her authority didn't happen in that moment alone.
Quiet too.
It began spreading afterward, quietly and invisibly as people started talking. Not gossiping, not exaggerating, but sharing what they had witnessed with a new level of honesty. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA discussions now felt confident enough to describe their own experiences, realizing that what they had assumed were isolated incidents were actually part of a larger pattern. The calm interaction they had seen proved something important. That her authority weakened the moment it was questioned respectfully. That realization spread faster than any argument ever could. In the days that followed, the HOA Karen noticed subtle changes. Emails she sent no longer received immediate compliance. Questions came back asking for clarification, references, and timelines. Requests that once went unchallenged were now met with polite follow-ups. None of this was aggressive, but it was firm, and firmness without hostility is difficult to overpower. She attempted to reassert her presence by reminding residents of upcoming meetings and deadlines, yet even her reminders felt different now, stripped of the urgency they once carried. People were listening, but they were no longer yielding automatically. What unsettled her most was that no one seemed afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced with understanding, and understanding gave people confidence. At the next casual neighborhood gathering, she sensed it immediately. Conversations paused briefly when she approached, then resumed naturally. There was no tension, no hostility, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. She was still part of the community but no longer above it. And that distinction mattered more than she realized. The exposure wasn't dramatic. There were no confrontations, no shouting matches, no official complaints filed that day. Instead, there was a collective shift in perception. People began to see her not as an authority figure who couldn't be questioned, but as a role holder who could be asked to explain herself. That shift removed the illusion that had protected her power for so long. She still enforced rules, but now she had to justify them. And justification requires transparency, something she had never needed before. By the time she fully understood what had happened, the damage was already done. Her power hadn't been taken from her. It had dissolved naturally when people stopped feeding it with fear. The neighborhood hadn't rebelled, it had matured. And in that maturity, her influence quietly shrank, not because she was attacked, but because she had been seen clearly for the first time. The video begins with a slow, almost unsettling calm as the camera moves through the neighborhood in the early hours of the morning, sunlight barely touching the rooftops, trash bins still out, and streets empty, while the narration hints that the real exposure didn't happen during the argument, the call, or the police visit, but in the quiet aftermath when everyone had time to think. What followed was not a dramatic collapse but a slow unraveling that HOA Karen couldn't interrupt or control. By midday, neighbors had already started comparing notes, casually at first, then with growing clarity, as small inconsistencies in her complaints began lining up into a much bigger picture. Dates didn't match, accusations contradicted each other, and patterns emerged that were impossible to ignore once seen. People who had once stayed neutral realized they weren't isolated cases. They were part of a routine. She had relied on the assumption that no one would talk to each other, that fear of fines or warnings would keep everyone silent, but that assumption failed spectacularly. Emails she had sent months apart suddenly looked identical in tone and wording, only the names changed. Screenshots of messages revealed how quickly she jumped to threats instead of solutions. Even those who never liked confrontation found themselves quietly stepping back from supporting her, not out of rebellion but out of embarrassment. The HOA board, sensing the shift, began asking procedural questions they had never bothered with before, requesting documentation instead of rubber stamping her demands. Karen noticed it too. Her emails got longer, more defensive, filled with unnecessary explanations that no one asked for. She tried to reframe the narrative, insisting it was all about community standards, but the phrase rang hollow now that everyone had receipts. The exposure wasn't loud, it was suffocating. Neighbors didn't argue with her, they simply stopped reacting. When she complained, people listened politely and did nothing. When she threatened enforcement, responses came slower, colder, more formal. The power she once enjoyed depended on urgency and fear, and without those, her authority shrank. She began attending HOA meetings visibly tense, correcting people mid-sentence, over-explaining minor points, revealing insecurity she never showed before. The irony was brutal. The more she tried to assert control, the more transparent her motives became. What truly broke her image wasn't one big revelation but the accumulation of small truths stacking up until denial became impossible. People realized she hadn't been protecting the neighborhood, she had been managing her own sense of importance. And once that illusion cracked, there was no dramatic showdown needed. No apology demanded. No public humiliation staged. She was exposed by normalcy, by neighbors comparing stories, by systems finally being followed properly, and by silence replacing fear. In trying to dominate without resistance, she had unknowingly set herself up to lose everything the moment people stopped playing along, proving that sometimes the most devastating exposure happens without a single fight being thrown. At this stage of the story, everything slows down in a way that feels uncomfortable because this is where power doesn't explode, it evaporates. HOA Karen is no longer acting out of confidence. She's operating out of habit, repeating behaviors that once worked but now land flat. Her emails still go out, carefully worded and overly formal, but the responses she gets are delayed, neutral, and stripped of emotion. The neighborhood has changed without announcing it. People who once rushed to comply now pause, reread, and ask questions. They don't argue. They don't accuse. They simply request clarification, documentation, and consistency. That alone destabilizes her more than any confrontation ever could. She starts attending meetings with prepared talking points, but the room feels colder, quieter, and less responsive. The authority she relied on was never rooted in rules, it was rooted in urgency and fear, and both are gone now. Neighbors are no longer isolated individuals dealing with her pressure alone. They are informed, connected, and calm. Someone notices how similar her complaints sound across different months. Someone else realizes how often rules are enforced only when she's personally involved. Another homeowner recalls being threatened over something that was later ignored when someone else did the same thing. None of these realizations cause outrage, but together they dismantle the illusion she built. Karen senses it and tries to tighten her grip, sending follow-ups, escalating language, and referencing her role more than ever, unaware that every attempt only confirms what people already suspect. The HOA board begins protecting itself, asking for procedure instead of favors, slowing approvals, and requesting written justification for actions that were once automatic. Karen isn't exposed in a dramatic way, she's exposed in a mundane one. She becomes predictable. And predictability is lethal to someone who thrives on intimidation. The neighborhood doesn't celebrate, doesn't confront, doesn't even discuss her openly. They simply stop reacting. And in that silence, her influence collapses completely, not with a fight, but with understanding. By this point in the story, the exposure has settled into something far more uncomfortable than public embarrassment: irrelevance. HOA Karen is still technically present, still holding a title, still sending messages, but the neighborhood no longer centers around her reactions. Her authority exists on paper, not in practice. What once felt like control now feels like noise, background interference people acknowledge politely and move past. Homeowners respond slowly, carefully, and only when necessary. Every message she sends is read with a new lens, one that looks for consistency rather than compliance. People notice how often she reframes situations to maintain leverage, how frequently she references her role instead of the rules themselves. That awareness strips her words of power. Meetings feel different now. Conversations are procedural, unemotional, and deliberate. She speaks, but no one rushes to agree. Questions replace nods. Silence replaces urgency. The shift is subtle but devastating. Karen tries to reclaim relevance by inserting herself into minor issues, correcting details that don't matter, reopening topics already resolved, but those efforts only highlight how disconnected she's become. The community has learned to function without reacting to her pressure. They follow legitimate processes, document interactions, and keep communication minimal. Even new residents, once easy targets, are quietly informed about how things really work. The exposure has matured into something permanent. A collective understanding. Karen isn't feared, hated, or challenged, she's simply understood. And understanding removes mystery, exaggeration, and intimidation all at once. The HOA board now treats her like any other member, no special consideration, no automatic backing. Decisions are made slowly, carefully, and transparently. That structure, once ignored, now protects everyone else. Karen realizes too late that the system she leaned on only worked when people didn't know how to use it themselves. Her downfall isn't dramatic, but it's final. The neighborhood doesn't celebrate. They don't talk about winning. Life just gets quieter, smoother, and less tense. And that calm becomes the clearest proof that she was never the authority she believed herself to be. She didn't lose power in a confrontation. She lost it when people stopped needing to think about her at all. By the time everything finally settles, there is no announcement, no apology, and no dramatic conclusion. Just a quiet understanding that the chapter is over. HOA Karen still lives in the neighborhood, still attends the occasional meeting, still sends the occasional message, but none of it carries weight anymore. The community has moved on in the most powerful way possible, by no longer centering her in their lives. Homeowners now understand the rules, the process, and their rights well enough that intimidation has no place to land. Conversations are calmer, shorter, and purposeful. Problems get solved without panic. Disputes are handled through proper channels instead of personal pressure. The tension that once hung over the neighborhood is gone, replaced by something far more stable: confidence. Karen's exposure never needed a villain or a hero because the truth didn't require performance. It revealed itself naturally, piece by piece, until denial wasn't possible. What makes the ending so satisfying is its simplicity. No one had to fight, argue, or escalate. The power she once held faded because it was never truly hers. It existed only as long as people believed in it. And once that belief disappeared, so did her influence. The neighborhood didn't win by overpowering her. They won by understanding the system better than she did. Life returns to normal, lawns get mowed, kids play outside, neighbors wave again, and the story closes not with revenge but with relief. In the end, HOA Karen wasn't defeated by resistance. She was undone by clarity, proving that the strongest exposure is often the quietest one.